The sun was setting on a desolate, purple-hued planet as Jack's damaged ship screeched to a halt on a barren stretch of rocky terrain. Smoke hissed from the cracked engines, and warning lights blinked furiously on the control panel. He sighed, running a hand through his messy brown hair. "Great. Just perfect," he muttered to himself, unbuckling his seatbelt. He had no choice but to find materials to repair his ship or risk being stranded forever. Jack grabbed his survival pack, slinging it over his shoulder before stepping out into the strange, alien world. The air was breathable, thankfully, though it carried an earthy, metallic scent. Strange bird-like creatures with translucent wings darted across the sky, their calls echoing in the distance. Despite the planet's eerie stillness, Jack felt an uneasy tension, like he was being watched. After hours of walking, the rocky landscape gave way to a patch of green, a small valley filled with twisted, vine-like trees and soft, glowing flowers. Jack crouched by a stream to refill his water supply when a rustling noise made him freeze. Slowly, he turned his head. An old woman stood a few feet away, her lavender skin glistening faintly under the dim light of the twin moons. She wore a flowing robe of deep blue, her posture bent with age, but her eyes sharp and penetrating. In one hand, she carried a wooden staff adorned with tiny crystals. Jack raised his hands cautiously, trying to appear non-threatening. "Oh, hello," he said, his voice tentative. The woman tilted her head, studying him with curiosity. She spoke, but the words were unlike anything Jack had ever heard, soft and melodic yet entirely alien. He gestured to himself. "I'm Jack. Human. My ship crashed." She didn't respond but motioned for him to follow. Jack hesitated, glancing back the way he came, but his ship was far, and night was falling fast. The chill in the air was growing, and he didn't have a better option. Taking a deep breath, he decided to trust her and followed. The path led them deeper into the valley, where glowing plants lined the way, casting soft light. Soon, they arrived at a hidden village nestled between the hills. The homes were built from smooth, pale stones, with curved roofs that shimmered like pearl. Dozens of beings, similar to the old woman but younger and more vibrant, stopped what they were doing to stare at Jack. Their expressions were a mix of curiosity and suspicion. The elderly woman raised her hand, murmuring something to the crowd. Gradually, they stepped back, allowing her to lead Jack to a modest dwelling near the center of the village. Inside, the air was warm, and the walls were decorated with intricate carvings of stars and constellations. The woman gestured for Jack to sit and placed a small device on the table. She spoke into it, and the device buzzed before translating her words into Jack's language. "You are not from here," she said, her voice calm yet filled with authority. Jack nodded. "Yeah, I'm from Earth. My ship's broken. I just need supplies to fix it, and I'll be on my way." The woman's eyes softened, though a trace of worry lingered in her gaze. "You arrived at a time of great need," she said. "There is something I must ask of you." Jack frowned, leaning forward. "Ask me. What do you mean?" Before she could answer, the door creaked open, and a young woman stepped inside. She was breathtaking, with soft, pale blue skin and striking, ocean-colored eyes that seemed to glow with an inner light. She glanced at Jack, her expression cautious yet intrigued. "This is my granddaughter," the old woman said. "And if you are willing, you may be the only one who can save her." Jack blinked, completely caught off guard. "Save her? From what?" The woman's eyes locked with his, filled with both desperation and determination. "From a fate worse than death." Jack sat in stunned silence, the weight of the old woman's words pressing down on him like the gravity of an alien sun. The room felt smaller now, the air thick with an unspoken urgency. The young woman, Lyra, stood quietly near the door, her striking blue skin and deep ocean-colored eyes catching the faint light of the glowing carvings on the walls. Her posture was calm, but her hands were clenched tightly, betraying her unease. "What exactly do you mean?" Jack asked, his voice low but steady. "I don't even know you, And now you're saying I have to save her." The old woman, Velara, sighed deeply and placed her staff against the wall. She sat across from Jack, her expression weary but resolute. "Our village has lived in peace for generations," she began. "But that peace is fragile. There is a warlord, brutal and relentless, who has demanded Lyra's hand in marriage. If we refuse, he will destroy everything we hold dear." Jack glanced at Lyra, who looked away, her jaw tightening. "And what does this have to do with me?" he asked cautiously. Lyra leaned forward, her silver eyes locking onto his. "You are an outsider, unbound by our traditions. If you claim Lyra as your bride, the warlord cannot challenge the bond. It would be considered sacred under our laws and recognized by galactic customs. He would have no choice but to leave us in peace." Jack stared at her, his mind reeling. "You're asking me to marry her? I don't even know her." Valera's gaze softened, but her tone remained firm. "This is not about love, human. This is about survival. Lyra's life, and the lives of everyone in this village, depend on your answer." Lyra finally spoke, her voice quiet but sharp. "I don't expect you to understand. This is not your fight. But if you walk away, you leave us with no hope." Jack rubbed his temples, his mind racing. He had crash-landed on this planet only hours ago, and now he was being asked to save an entire village by pretending to marry someone he had just met. It sounded insane, but the desperation in Valara's eyes and the quiet strength in Lyra's voice struck a chord deep within him. "What happens if I agree?" Jack asked cautiously. Valara's expression lightened, as if a sliver of hope had pierced through the darkness. "We will hold a ceremony, simple but binding. It will be enough to satisfy our laws and dissuade the warlord. You would not need to remain here forever, only long enough for the threat to pass. And if the warlord doesn't back down," Jack pressed. Lyra spoke again, her voice firm. "He will back down. He thrives on fear, but he will not risk violating sacred customs. It would ruin his reputation, even among his own people." Jack leaned back in his chair, his gaze flickering between Valara and Lyra. He felt a pull, something deeper than obligation. He had seen oppression before, back on Earth, and he couldn't stand the thought of walking away while innocent lives were at stake. "All right," he said finally, his voice steady. "I'll do it, but only because I don't like bullies." Valara's face broke into a relieved smile, and Lyra's expression softened, though her eyes still held a flicker of doubt. "Thank you," Valara said quietly. "You may have just saved us all." Jack glanced at Lyra, who met his gaze with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. "Let's get one thing straight," he said. "This is just an act. I'm not here to play hero or Prince Charming." Lyra tilted her head, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Good," she said, "because I have no interest in being rescued by one." As the room settled into silence, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped into something far bigger than himself. The village square bustled with quiet energy as preparations for the bonding ceremony began. Glowing lanterns were strung between the tall, vine-like trees, casting a warm, soft light over the gathering space. Jack stood off to the side, adjusting the borrowed tunic that Valara had insisted he wear. The fabric was rough against his skin, and he tugged at the collar uncomfortably. "This feels ridiculous," Jack muttered under his breath. Valara approached him with a calm smile, carrying a small bowl filled with what looked like silver dust. "You'll be fine," she assured him. "It's a simple ritual. Just follow my instructions, and no one will question the bond." Jack glanced at the crowd gathering in the square. The villagers watched him with a mix of curiosity and hope, their alien features illuminated by the flickering lights. At the center of it all stood Lyra, dressed in a flowing gown of shimmering blue. Her expression was unreadable, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as if she were trying to distance herself from the moment. Jack cleared his throat, trying to ease the growing tension in his chest. "What happens after this?" he asked Valara quietly. If all goes well, the warlord will have no choice but to honor the bond. Valeria replied, "You and Lyra will be safe." Jack nodded, though the weight of the situation still pressed heavily on his shoulders. He had agreed to help, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into the unknown. The ceremony began as Valeria stepped into the center of the square, raising her staff high. The crowd fell silent, their glowing eyes focused on her. She spoke in her melodic language, her voice carrying a tone of authority and reverence. "Come forward," Valeria said, her words translated through the small device pinned to her robe. Jack hesitated for a moment before stepping into the circle. Lyra joined him, her movements graceful but measured. She stood beside him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Valeria dipped her fingers into the bowl of silver dust and gestured for Jack and Lyra to extend their hands. Jack glanced at Lyra, who nodded slightly. He lifted his hand, and Valeria pressed a small amount of the dust onto his palm. It felt cool and weightless, like a faint breeze against his skin. "Repeat after me," Valeria instructed. Jack hesitated, then followed her lead, repeating the unfamiliar words with as much precision as he could manage. Lyra did the same, her voice steady and unwavering. As the final words of the ritual were spoken, Valeria raised her staff once more, and the villagers erupted into a soft, melodic chant. Jack could feel the energy of the moment, an almost tangible connection forming between him and Lyra. It was strange, unsettling, and yet oddly comforting. When the chanting subsided, Valeria stepped back and addressed the crowd. "It is done," she declared. "The bond is complete." The villagers cheered, their voices echoing through the valley. Lyra turned to Jack, her expression guarded but with a hint of something softer beneath the surface. "You didn't butcher the words too badly," she said, her tone dry but not unkind. Jack chuckled, the tension easing slightly. "I'll take that as a compliment." Before either of them could say more, a loud horn sounded in the distance. The atmosphere shifted instantly, the celebration giving way to alarm. Valeria's face darkened, and the villagers began to murmur in fear. "The warlord," Valeria said, her voice grim. "He's here." Jack's heart sank. He had hoped for more time to prepare, but it seemed the fight was coming sooner than expected. Lyra stepped closer to him, her gaze steady and determined. "Are you ready for this, human?" she asked. Jack met her eyes, his jaw tightening. "I hope so." The sound of the horn echoed across the valley, sending chills down Jack's spine. The once lively village square now stood eerily silent, with villagers retreating to the safety of their homes. Only a few brave souls, including Valeria and Lyra, remained outside, their faces tense but resolute. From the northern hill, a line of massive, beast-like creatures appeared, their glowing eyes cutting through the twilight. Mounted atop them were armored figures, each one towering and menacing. At their center rode the warlord, his armor blackened with jagged edges that seemed to drink in the light. His presence was oppressive, radiating danger and power. Jack swallowed hard, gripping the small blade Valeria had given him earlier. Not that he thought it would be of much use. "That's him," he whispered to Lyra, his voice tight. Lyra nodded, her expression stoic. "His name is Voreth. He thrives on fear and destruction. If he thinks this bond is false, he'll destroy us all without hesitation." Jack took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "Then let's make sure he believes it." Voreth dismounted, his heavy boots hitting the ground with a thud. His piercing, reptilian eyes scanned the square, finally landing on Jack. A cruel smile spread across his face as he strode forward, flanked by two equally intimidating guards. "You must be the human," Voreth said, his voice deep and guttural. "I've heard much about your kind, weak, fragile, and full of empty bravado." Jack stepped forward, his heart pounding but his expression steady. "And you must be the warlord who thinks he can intimidate everyone into submission. Nice to meet you." A ripple of tension spread through the crowd. Voreth's smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "Bold words for someone so small," he said, taking another step closer. "Tell me, human, what makes you think you're worthy of claiming her?" He gestured toward Lyra with a dismissive wave. Jack squared his shoulders, refusing to be cowed. "Lyra and I are bonded. Your traditions make it clear. Once bonded, no one can challenge the union. Or are you suggesting you're above your own laws?" Voreth's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Jack thought he might strike him down right then and there. But the warlord simply laughed, a low, menacing sound that echoed through the square. "You think words and rituals will save you?" he sneered. "Prove it. Show me this so-called bond." Lyra stepped forward, her voice steady and commanding. The ceremony was performed in accordance with our ancient traditions, witnessed by the entire village. "The bond is real, and you have no right to challenge it." Voreth turned his gaze to her, his expression darkening. "You overstep, elder. But very well. Let me test this human's resolve." He gestured to one of his guards, who stepped forward, drawing a massive, serrated blade. Jack's stomach twisted, but he held his ground. "What's the test?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Voreth grinned, a cruel gleam in his eyes. "A simple duel. Prove your strength and courage, and I will leave. Fail, and I will take what I want." Lyra stepped forward, her voice sharp. "This is not part of the law, Voreth. You're twisting tradition to suit your own desires." Voreth smirked. "And what will you do about it, little one? Challenge me yourself." Jack put a hand on Lyra's arm, stopping her from saying more. "It's fine," he said quietly. He turned back to Voreth, his jaw set. "I accept your challenge." The crowd gasped, and Lyra's eyes widened in shock. "Jack, you don't have to." "I do," Jack interrupted, his voice firm. "If I back down now, he'll never leave us alone." Voreth's grin widened, clearly pleased. "Very well, human. Let's see if you're as brave as you pretend to be." The square cleared as the villagers formed a wide circle around the combatants. Jack gripped his blade tightly, his heart pounding as Voreth's guard approached, towering over him like a shadow. As the duel began, Jack's mind raced. He wasn't a warrior, but he wasn't about to let Voreth win. Not today. The square fell deathly silent as Jack stood facing the towering guard, the serrated blade in his opponent's hand catching the faint light of the glowing lanterns. The guard smirked, his confidence evident in every movement. Jack tightened his grip on his small blade, the weight of it suddenly feeling too light for what he was about to face. "Remember," Lyra's voice echoed in his mind from earlier, "your strength lies in your quick thinking, not brute force. Use it wisely." The guard lunged first, his massive blade cutting through the air with a deadly whistle. Jack barely dodged to the side, feeling the wind of the swing rush past his face. He stumbled but quickly regained his footing, his heart pounding like a drum. The villagers watched in tense silence, their glowing eyes fixed on the scene. Lyra stood at the edge of the circle, her hands clenched tightly. She wanted to intervene, but tradition bound her as much as it bound the warlord. The guard swung again, this time with more precision. Jack ducked, rolling to the side, and narrowly avoiding the blade. He realized quickly that if he stayed on the defensive, he wouldn't last long. He needed to act, and fast. "You're slower than I expected," Jack said, his voice loud enough for the crowd to hear. The guard froze for a moment, then narrowed his eyes. "What did you say, human?" Jack grinned, though his heart was still racing. "I said you're slow. I've seen cargo loaders move faster than you." The crowd murmured, a ripple of surprise passing through them. Even Voreth raised an eyebrow, intrigued by Jack's boldness. The guard growled, charging at Jack with renewed fury. But this time, Jack was ready. He sidestepped at the last moment, causing the guard to stumble forward. Taking advantage of the opening, Jack swung his blade, aiming for the straps on the guard's armor. The straps snapped, causing a piece of the heavy plating to fall to the ground. The guard turned, furious, but now slightly unbalanced without the full weight of his armor. Jack smirked, his confidence growing. "Looks like you're falling apart," Jack taunted. The guard roared, charging again, but Jack used the same tactic, dodging, moving, and striking small, precise blows. Each time, he weakened the guard's armor and his composure. "Stay still," the guard bellowed, his frustration evident. "Why would I do that?" Jack shot back, darting out of reach once more. The crowd began to shift, their initial doubt in the human turning to curiosity, and even admiration. Lyra's tense expression softened slightly as she watched Jack fight not with brute strength but with strategy. Finally, the guard made a desperate, wide swing, putting all his strength into one last attack. Jack ducked low, rolling under the blade and coming up behind the guard. With a quick slash, he severed the straps holding the guard's remaining armor. The heavy pieces clattered to the ground, leaving the guard exposed and panting for breath. Jack didn't attack further. Instead, he stepped back, raising his blade. "Yield," he said firmly. The guard hesitated, glancing at Voreth. The warlord's expression darkened, but he gave a subtle nod. The guard growled, dropping his blade to the ground in surrender. The villagers erupted into cheers, their voices filling the square. Lyra let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding, her lips curving into a small smile. Voreth stepped forward, his piercing eyes fixed on Jack. "You've proven yourself, human," he said, his voice begrudgingly respectful. "But know this, I don't forget challenges to my authority. Enjoy your victory while it lasts." Jack met his gaze, refusing to back down. "And you should remember this, I don't scare easily." Voreth turned, his cloak billowing behind him as he mounted his beast. With a signal to his men, they retreated into the shadows, leaving the village in peace, for now. As the crowd began to disperse, Lyra approached Jack, her expression a mixture of relief and gratitude. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. Jack wiped the sweat from his brow, giving her a tired smile. "Maybe not, but I wasn't about to let him win." For the first time, Lyra's guarded demeanor cracked, and she offered him a genuine smile. "Thank you." Jack nodded, his mind already racing with thoughts of what might come next. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The village was alive with celebration after Jack's victory. Lanterns glowed brighter, and the air was filled with the hum of voices as the villagers expressed their relief. Jack sat near a fire, exhaustion settling in, while Velara handed him a warm cup of herbal tea. "You've done more for us than I ever could have hoped," Velara said, her voice filled with gratitude. Jack nodded, sipping the tea, its warmth easing his frayed nerves. "It's not over yet," he replied, his eyes scanning the now peaceful square. "That warlord won't just forget this. He'll be back." Lyra stood nearby, listening to their conversation. She stepped closer, her expression serious. "Jack is right," she said, her voice steady. "Voreth isn't the type to accept defeat. We fought time, but it's not enough. He'll come back stronger and angrier." Velara frowned, her usual calm demeanor faltering. "Then we must prepare," she said. "But how?" Jack stared into the flames, his mind turning. "We need to think like him. If Voreth plans to return, it'll be with overwhelming force. We can't match him with numbers or weapons, but maybe we don't have to." Lyra tilted her head, curious. "What do you mean?" Jack leaned forward, the firelight reflecting in his determined eyes. "Every bully has a weakness. We need to find his and use it against him. He thrives on fear, right? What if we turn that fear back on him?" Lyra's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "You're suggesting we make him believe the risk isn't worth the reward." "Exactly," Jack said, nodding. "But first, we need to figure out what he values most, and what he's willing to lose." Velara's gaze shifted to the stars above. Voreth's power lies in his control over smaller clans. If they see him as weak or vulnerable, they might abandon him. Jack smirked. "Then we just need to make him look weak." The group fell into silence as they pondered their next move. Suddenly, a young villager ran into the square, his face pale and his breathing ragged. "Elder Villara," he cried. "What is it?" "Rin?" Villara asked, rising to her feet. The young man hesitated, glancing nervously at Jack and Lyra before speaking. "I saw them. Scouts from Voreth's army. They're watching us from the hills." The festive atmosphere instantly dissolved, replaced by a wave of tension. The villagers began whispering among themselves, fear creeping back into their voices. Jack stood, setting his cup aside. "Scouts mean he's already planning his next move." Villara placed a reassuring hand on the young villager's shoulder. "You did well to warn us. Rin, go and rest." As Rin left, Jack turned to Lyra. "We need to act fast. If Voreth scouts report back that the village is unprepared, it'll only embolden him." Lyra nodded, her eyes burning with determination. "Then we can't let them leave." Villara hesitated. "You mean to confront them directly? That's dangerous." Jack shook his head. "Not directly. If they think we're on the offensive, it'll make them cautious. We need to create the illusion that this village is far more protected than it actually is." Lyra's lips curved into a small smile. "A bluff." "Exactly," Jack said. "If we play this right, those scouts will leave with a story that makes Voreth think twice." Villara nodded slowly. "Then we must trust your instincts, Jack. What do you need?" Jack glanced around the square, taking in the resources available. "Lights, sound, and smoke," he said. "If we can make it look like this village is guarded by forces they can't see, it'll spook them." As the villagers worked to set Jack's plan into motion, the tension in the air shifted. Lanterns were repositioned to cast eerie shadows, sound amplifiers were rigged to create the illusion of distant warriors, and smoke machines hidden among the trees added an ominous haze. As night fell, Jack, Lyra, and a small group of villagers took positions near the edges of the village. From his vantage point, Jack spotted the scouts. 3 figures crouched in the shadows of the hills, their eyes fixed on the village. Jack activated the first part of the plan, signaling the hidden lights and sounds. The forest came alive with the glow of shifting lights and the distant hum of voices and footsteps, amplified to sound like an approaching army. The scouts stiffened, their movements hesitant as they tried to make sense of what they were seeing and hearing. "They're scared," Lyra whispered, watching the scouts' nervous glances. "Good," Jack replied. "Now let's make them run." He triggered the final part of the bluff, a burst of light and smoke from the center of the village, accompanied by the sound of what could only be described as a roaring beast. The scouts panicked, scrambling back up the hill and disappearing into the darkness. As the smoke cleared, Jack let out a relieved sigh. That should buy us some time. The village woke to an uneasy quiet the next morning. The night's bluff had worked. Voreth's scouts had fled, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the warlord responded. Jack stood in the square, inspecting the smoke machines and amplifiers they had used. Lyra approached, her steps silent as she joined him. "Do you think they believed it?" she asked, her voice soft but edged with concern. Jack shrugged, adjusting a wire. "They believed enough to run, but it won't hold Voreth back forever. Bullies don't like looking weak. He'll come back, and he'll want to make an example out of us." Lyra frowned, crossing her arms. "Then we need to be ready for him. What's the next step?" Jack looked at her, admiring the resolve in her eyes. "The next step is making sure he doesn't even get close. We need a final plan, something that forces him to retreat for good." Before they could discuss further, Villara hurried over, her face pale. "Voreth's forces are approaching," she said. "I just received word from the watchtower." Jack's chest tightened. "How many?" "Dozens," Villara replied grimly. "More than we've ever seen before." Lyra clenched her fists. "He's not just coming for revenge. He's coming to destroy us." Jack nodded, his mind racing. "We need to stick to the plan. Keep the villagers hidden, and make it look like we have reinforcements." Valera hesitated. "Jack, if this fails—" "It won't," Jack said firmly, cutting her off. "We don't have another choice." As the villagers hurried to their hiding places, Jack and Lyra took their positions near the edge of the square. The amplifiers were ready, and the lights were in place. Jack double-checked his makeshift triggers, his hand steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. The ground trembled as Voreth's forces arrived, their massive beasts stomping into the valley. At the front of the line was Voreth himself, his dark armor gleaming menacingly in the sunlight. He raised a hand, and his forces came to a halt just outside the village. "Villagers of Zethara," Voreth's voice boomed, amplified by a device on his chest. "You dare defy me? You think your pathetic tricks will save you? Come out now, or I will tear this place apart stone by stone." Jack stepped into the square, his small blade strapped to his side. He raised his hand, signaling the first part of the plan. The amplifiers roared to life, filling the valley with the sound of marching feet and the faint hum of distant voices. Lights flickered among the trees, casting eerie shadows that made it seem like an army was approaching. Voreth's forces shifted uneasily, their beasts growling as the strange sounds and lights unsettled them. Jack took a deep breath and shouted, his voice carrying over the noise. "This village is protected, Voreth. Turn back now, or face the consequences." Voreth's eyes narrowed, and he dismounted his beast, stepping forward with deliberate, heavy steps. "You think you can scare me with tricks and illusions," he growled. "I see through your lies, human." Jack's heart pounded, but he stood his ground. "Do you?" he challenged, his voice steady. "Or are you just afraid to find out what happens if you push further?" Before Voreth could respond, Lyra activated the final part of the plan. A hidden amplifier let out a low, guttural roar, followed by a burst of smoke that obscured the square. Through the haze, shadows of figures moved, their shapes distorted and otherworldly. Voreth hesitated, his confidence faltering for the first time. His forces murmured nervously, their fear palpable. "This isn't over, human," Voreth snarled, but his voice lacked the usual venom. "You've made an enemy today." With a sharp gesture, he turned and mounted his beast. His forces followed, retreating into the distance as the village watched in stunned silence. When the last of Voreth's troops disappeared, the villagers erupted into cheers. Jack slumped against a tree, exhaustion finally catching up to him. Lyra approached, a rare smile on her lips. "You did it," she said softly. "You stood against him, and you won." Jack shook his head, his lips curling into a tired smile. "We won. All of us." Valera stepped forward, her eyes shining with gratitude. "You've given us hope, Jack. We will never forget this." Jack nodded, his gaze meeting Lyra's. He knew this wasn't just about one village. It was about showing that even the smallest acts of courage could stand against the greatest forces of fear. To be continued. The village of Zethara was quieter now. The roar of the battle had long faded, replaced by the soft sounds of nature and the murmur of villagers talking amongst themselves. The threat of Voreth's forces had passed, but the aftermath of the victory hung in the air like the fading glow of the evening sun. Jack stood by the village square, watching the villagers go about their tasks. It was hard to believe that just days ago they had been cowering in fear, and now they were rebuilding, stronger and more confident. He couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Pride not only for himself, but for the entire village. They had fought back, not with force, but with courage, strategy, and unity. Lyra joined him, her footsteps light but purposeful. She had changed since their first meeting, no longer the guarded, wary woman who had barely trusted Jack. There was something in her eyes now, a quiet understanding, and maybe even a hint of admiration. "You did it," Lyra said, her voice soft, but filled with meaning. "You really did." Jack turned to her, his tired eyes meeting hers. "We did. All of us. If we hadn't worked together, it wouldn't have worked." She smiled slightly, her eyes flickering with something deeper, but she quickly looked away. Still, I think you've earned more than just gratitude. You've earned our trust and my respect. Jack chuckled, rubbing his neck. I wasn't exactly looking for respect, but I'll take it. The village was still busy with preparations. Women and men alike were gathering supplies, building new homes, and tending to the injured. The mood had shifted completely. There was no longer the heavy weight of fear in the air. Instead, the villagers were filled with a quiet sense of determination, the belief that they could stand on their own. Valera approached them, her eyes shining with a mix of pride and relief. Jack, Lyra, she began, thank you for everything. I don't think we'll ever be able to repay you for what you've done for us. Jack smiled warmly, his exhaustion fading as he looked at the elder. No need to thank me. This is your victory, too. Lyra stood a little taller, her voice more confident. Jack's right. This is the start of something new. We're no longer just survivors. We're fighters. Valera looked between them, her eyes thoughtful. And what of you, Jack? What will you do now? Jack paused. He hadn't really thought about it. He had come to Zethara with one goal, to fix his ship and move on. But now, with Vorith gone and the village safe, he felt conflicted. The thought of leaving didn't sit well with him. I don't know, Jack admitted. I came here to fix my ship and go back home. But after everything, I don't feel right just leaving. Lyra raised an eyebrow. What are you saying? Jack took a deep breath. I'm saying, maybe I stay a little longer, help you rebuild, make sure no one else comes after you. I don't know if it's what I'm meant to do, but it feels like the right thing. Valera's eyes softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. If you stay, you will always have a place here, Jack. Jack looked at Lyra, searching her face for a hint of what she might think. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, there was a quiet understanding between them. I think you've earned a place here, too, she said quietly, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Jack's heart gave a small leap, though he tried to hide his surprise. Well, in that case, I guess I'm staying. For the first time since he had arrived on Zethara, Jack truly felt like he was where he was supposed to be. It wasn't the home he had known, but it was a home of sorts, filled with people who now believed in themselves, just as much as they had believed in him. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. As the village settled into the night, Jack stood with Lyra, watching the stars begin to twinkle above. It was the same sky he had looked at from his ship, back when he was just a traveler, always searching for the next destination. But now, for the first time, he didn't feel the need to move. He was exactly where he was meant to be. The village of Zethara had become a place of peace and hope. The once distant hum of fear had been replaced with the quiet sounds of people working together, building and planning for the future. Jack stood at the edge of the village, watching the busy workers and the children playing in the sun-dappled square. It felt like a world away from the chaos that had arrived with Vorith. He had been here for weeks now, helping with repairs and offering his skills wherever needed. His ship was still in pieces, but he didn't mind. The village needed him, and in a strange way, he felt needed. It wasn't the life he had imagined when he first crashed here, but it was one he had grown to appreciate. Lyra walked up beside him, her presence comforting and familiar. Her once stern face had softened over time, and Jack had noticed how her confidence had grown along with her trust in the village, and in him. "You're quiet today," she said, her voice calm, but with a playful edge. Jack turned to her, giving her a half-smile. "Just thinking about how much has changed. It feels like a lifetime ago when I first arrived, unsure of what was going to happen." Lyra smiled back, her eyes sparkling. "And now look at us. We're not just surviving anymore. We're thriving." Jack chuckled, then grew serious. "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad I stayed. This place, it feels like home." Lyra's expression softened. "I'm glad you stayed too. You've done more for us than anyone could have imagined, not just with the warlord, but in helping us rebuild." He looked at her, his gaze lingering longer than usual. "I didn't just help you rebuild the village, Lyra," he said quietly. "I helped myself, too. I didn't realize it at first, but I was lost. I think I needed a place to belong." Lyra's smile faded into something more tender, and she took a step closer to him. "You've always belonged here, Jack, even if you didn't know it." Jack felt a warmth spread through him. He had never truly believed in the idea of fate or destiny, but now, in this quiet village, surrounded by people who trusted him, he began to wonder if there might be some truth to it after all. "Are you planning to leave now?" Lyra asked softly, her voice filled with a quiet hope. Jack shook his head slowly, looking out at the horizon. "No, I think I've found what I've been looking for, without even realizing it. This is what I need." Lyra reached out, her hand brushing against his. The touch was light, but it sent a ripple of warmth through him. They had come a long way from the tense first meeting between them, when trust had been hard to come by. Now Jack couldn't imagine being anywhere else. "I think I'm beginning to understand that too," Lyra said quietly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the village filled the air, the steady hum of life continuing on as it always had, but now with a new sense of purpose. The villagers had found strength in themselves, and Jack had found a place where he truly belonged. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, Jack and Lyra stood side by side, watching as the stars began to appear one by one. "Do you think the warlord will come back?" Lyra asked after a while, her voice almost wistful. Jack shook his head. "I don't think so. We've shown him we're not afraid of him anymore. And I don't think he's foolish enough to challenge us again." Lyra nodded, her face thoughtful. "We've proved ourselves." Jack turned to her, his heart swelling with emotion. "We didn't just prove something to him, Lyra. We proved it to ourselves." She smiled up at him, her eyes soft and filled with quiet affection. "I think we both know what comes next." Jack smiled back, his heart pounding in his chest. "Yeah, I think we do." And so, as the stars blinked into existence above them, Jack knew that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. A new chapter, one where the village would continue to grow and thrive, and where he and Lyra would find their place together. The future was bright, and it was theirs to shape.